3 of the fantasy football season, and his wide receiver sits every matchup. This week, the first matchup, Thursday Night Football, New England Patriots at the New York Jets at the Pats. We really haven't seen much in the first 2 weeks at the receiving position. I know Jalen Polk scored a touchdown last week, but only 2 catches, 12 yards, and found the end zone. Demariel Douglas, he's not doing much in the early going with Tyquan Thornton. And this week in a tough matchup versus a good defense, I wouldn't start any of these wide receivers. It's Garrett Wilson. So far, it's been a struggle for him in the early going, but I think this could be the breakout game for Garrett Wilson in Week 3 in the Jets home opener. And he's locked in each and every week as a start now to Mike Williams, Alan Lazard. They're both sits for me. Mike Williams, he's been on a snap count. Week 1, he didn't do much. Week 2, only a catch for 19 yards at the Tennessee Titans. So he needs his snaps up, and he needs to be 100% healthy for him to be a viable option. And Alan Lazard, Week 1, he had a big ball game, 2 touchdowns, one of them in garbage time. And then last week, he didn't do much at the Tennessee Titans, so he's tough to trust, and he's a sit. Denver Broncos at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It's tough to trust a Bronco wide receiver as well, and this is a pretty tough matchup versus middle-of-the-pack Tampa Bay Buc defense. Cortland Sutton, he didn't do much the first couple weeks of the season. Josh Reynolds, he's showed some flashes, but it'll be tough for fantasy owners to have confidence in your basic 12, even 14-team leagues to go out there and put Reynolds in the lineup. But he's definitely a nice waiver wire pickup, is Reynolds. But I have to see a few more weeks out of him for him to be a starter or even a flex option. He's a sit. And Marvin Mims, we haven't seen much out of him as well. Now to Tampa Bay, Mike Evans, a monster Week 1. Week 2, he didn't do much. And Chris Godwin, the first 2 weeks, he's been one of the best wide receivers in fantasy football. And this week, I know this Denver secondary, obviously a good unit led by Patrick Surtain. I believe both wide receivers could go out there and have a good ball game, and they must starts pretty much each and every week in the early going. Jalen McMillan, his role has been decent as a third wide receiver, but not enough consistency or points on the board for him to be a starter. He's a sit. Houston Texans at the Minnesota Vikings. Nico Collins, he's locked in, one of the best wide receivers in all fantasy football. 2 monster games in a row to start the season, over 100 yards, must start. Stephon Diggs, 2 touchdowns in Week 1. Last week, he didn't do much. It was the Nico Collins show for the most part, but I still have confidence in Diggs. He's the captain on this team. And obviously, as well, he's in there in all 2 wide receiver sets in a potential shootout. He's a start versus one of his former teams. Tank Dell's a sit the first 2 weeks. Snap count is down. The production isn't there. And he needs an injury to either Diggs or Nico Collins to have week in and week out value. But after the first 2 weeks, not doing much. And like I said, the snaps haven't been there. He's a sit. Justin Jefferson, a start. He said he's good to go. He feels like he's going to play. So I'm going off what Jefferson is saying. And obviously, he don't play. This is a big hit for fantasy owners and the Vikings. But Justin Jefferson, if he plays not even at 100%, he's a top play every week. Jalen Naylor, 2 weeks in a row, has found the end zone. And I think he's a flex option in those deeper 12-team, 14-team formats as Jalen Naylor. Him and Sam Darnold have good rapport. Jordan Addison, he was banged up Week 1, still played. Week 2, he didn't play. Week 3, Addison saying it's looking like he's going to play in this ball game. But I think Jalen Naylor is moving up quietly on the depth chart, and definitely a Sam Darnold favorite where they had a lot of second-team reps early in training camp before Jay McCarthy went down with injury. Los Angeles Chargers at the Pittsburgh Steelers. Quentin Johnson, so far the first 2 weeks, I think he's looked pretty decent as Quentin Johnson. He's the number 1 wide receiver on this roster for the Chargers. Week 1, a mediocre game. And then last week went out there, I know it was the Carolina Panthers. He found the end zone twice. We know Johnson, he was a first-round pick last season in the NFL draft. And maybe he just needed a year to get acclimated. So this week, I have him as a back-end flex option. Lad McConkey, Joshua Palmer. McConkey, Week 1, found the end zone. He looked decent. Week 2, he didn't do much. And he's tough to trust as well as a slot guy week in and week out. So this week in a tough matchup versus one of the better defenses in the league. McConkey and Joshua Palmer, who've been inconsistent wide receivers, are sits for me. George Pickens, he's a start. I know last week he didn't do much. A couple plays got called back, and him and Justin Fields just missed on some big plays as well. And Justin Fields, he's looked good in the early going for this Pittsburgh Steelers team. And I think George Pickens, as a back-end number 2 wide receiver or number 3 receiver in those deeper leagues, he's a start pretty much every week. Calvin Austin, he's a sit. He had a couple grabs in that Week 2 ball game at the Denver Broncos. Well, pretty much his passing games consisted of George Pickens, Pat Freiermuth, and out of the backfield, Jalen Warren, and at times Najee Harris Philadelphia Eagles Saints. So A.J. Brown's going to miss multiple weeks with the hamstring injury. So Devonta Smith is going to be the number one wide receiver for this Philadelphia Eagle team. He's locked in every week as a start now, especially as the number one. Jahan Dotson, I have to see more out of him to put him in the lineup as an every week start. But Dotson definitely could have upside, and he's a former top prospect in college football, Jahan Dotson. So we'll see if he can fit this offense as the coming weeks come on. And now to the New Orleans Saints. Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, both starts each and every week. Olave, I know week one was off to a slow start. Week two, the stats were a little bit better. But I think Chris Olave is going to get better as the weeks go on. And we know he's been a solid wide receiver in the first few seasons of his NFL career. And Rashid Shaheed, one of the best deep ball threats in the early going in all the NFL. And him and Derek Carr, they're on the same page. They're going out there making big plays for this New Orleans Saints team, and then a potential shootout indoors for this New Orleans Saints team. I think Rashid Shaheed goes out there once again and has a good performance. He's a start. Green Bay Packers at the Tennessee Titans. It's tough to start most of these Packer guys, especially with Malik Willis once again going to start a quarterback. And last week only had 14 pass attempts, but Jaden Reed, I'll give him a flex appeal this week. I think he's still a top 36 option. Jaden Reed, I would give him flex appeal this week. He can move all around the field. Is Jaden Reed. You could use him in sweeps. You could use him as a gadget guy. And he's got that yard after catch ability where he could take a screen to the house as well. So I think Jaden Reed, he could get some production in. I'm not saying a big ball game, but as a flex option, I think he's fine. Christian Watson, Romeo Dubes, Dotavian Wicks, they're all sits for me. Watson last week, he didn't do much for this Green Bay Packer team. And also, Romeo Dubes got a decent ball game with 9 fantasy points in PPR leagues. But like I said, if Willis is only going to drop back and throw the football 15, 20 times in this one at the Tennessee Titans, there's not going to be much production from anybody in the passing game. And Dotavian Wicks last week did find the end zone, which was good to see. But if he didn't have that touchdown, it pretty much was a quiet day once again for him in week 2 versus the Indianapolis Colts. So those 3 wideouts, versus our 6 this week. Now to the Tennessee Titans. Ridley coming off a 2 touchdown game. He got paid as the number 1 wide receiver in the offseason for this Tennessee Titan team. And so far, he's looking like that. But this week in a tougher matchup, he's a flex option for me. Those were some fluky touchdowns, I believe, in the week 2 game versus the New York Jets. That deep ball that just threaded the needle and got in there. He dove and made the catch. And then a jet sweep for a touchdown early in that game. He's a flex. Is Calvin Ridley. I don't think he's top 24 option, but top 36. And DeAndre Hopkins, non-existent the first couple weeks of the season, even though I know he's not 100%. Can't trust him. He's a sit. And Tyler Boyd hasn't showed much. He's a sit. Giants at the Cleveland Browns. Malik Neighbors taking the league by storm in the first 2 games of his NFL career. He's a start. I know it's a tough matchup. I know Denzel Ward is going to be on him. But Malik Neighbors, he's a top talent in my opinion. And if he was with another team, it'll be sky's the limit even more. After coming off a monster game in week 2, Neighbors, he's pretty much a wideout. I have locked in weekly starting. Wan'Dale Robinson, he scored a touchdown, which was good to see in week 2 at the Commanders, but he didn't do much besides that touchdown. He's a sit, tough to trust in your decent formats in 12-14 teams. And Darius Slayton, a sit is for me as well. Amari Cooper, a flex option, first 2 weeks. He hasn't done much as Amari Cooper. We know he's a talented receiver, but also he is in his 30s. And you know, wide receivers start falling apart and declining in 30 years old. So this week, even in a great matchup versus a weak New York Giants secondary, Amari Cooper, I can't trust him 100%, but I still have him as a flex option. Jerry Jeudy, the first 2 games as a Cleveland Brown, he's actually gone out there and he's been the best Brown wide receiver, even though that's not saying much. So Jeudy this week, I got to see 2 more weeks out of him to have fantasy appeal and be an option for fantasy owners. So he's a sit. Elijah Moore coming off a 10-point PPR league ball game, but Elijah Moore, his upside really isn't all that great, and he's the number 3 wide receiver anyway for this Brown team. He's a sit. Chicago Bears at the Indianapolis Colts. DJ Moore, so far he hasn't done much, where last season he was a monster, one of the best wide receivers in fantasy football with Justin Fields, but him and Caleb Williams really aren't on the same page. He's tough to trust, putting up monster points, but he's still a top 24 option. Is DJ Moore, and he's a star. Keenan Allen already banged up, already missed a game in week 2. I don't think he's going to be 100% the whole season on and off. Is Keenan Allen. And Caleb Williams, if he's having trouble with DJ Moore at the wide receiver position, I don't believe Keenan Allen is going to be much of an option weekly. And this week coming off injury, and who knows if he even plays. He's a sit. Roma Dunze had an opportunity. He didn't do much. He's tough to trust early on. And this all relies on the offensive line, which hasn't blocked well. And Caleb Williams, he's just chucking that ball up there at times and holding on to it too long. And he took a lot of big hits in the Week 2 loss at the Texans. It's Michael Pittman, Alec Pierce, both flex options. I think Pittman, he don't fit this offense well with Anthony Richardson at the quarterback position. Pittman's more an underneath and slat route runner, where this offense wants to push the football down the field and get their speedy guys the football, is what Anthony Richardson is trying to do. And also as well, Anthony Richardson, not a lot of pass attempts in the first 2 weeks of the season. Even trailing last week, you would think he'd be in the 40, 45 pass attempts. He didn't come close to that as Richardson. So Pittman definitely struggling in the early going. Pierce, he's a flex option as well. 2 touchdowns first 2 weeks of the season. He's a deep ball threat for this Indianapolis Colts team, and he caught a touchdown in the back of the end zone in last week's ball game. 5 catches, 56 yards and a touch. And this week, I think in deeper leagues, he could be a flex option. Donnie Mitchell hasn't shown much in the early going. Richardson have just missed on some deep balls, but I can't trust him. He's a sit. And Josh Downs returning off injury. We'll see how he plays with Anthony Richardson, because last season they didn't really play together before Richardson went out for the year with the injury, so he's a sit. Miami Dolphins at the Seahawks, even with 2 out in this one and Thompson at quarterback. I'm still going to trust Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle as 2 wide receivers who can overcome poor quarterback play and not have a good quarterback, where their yards after catch and their route running ability could get them open. And I know this is a decent Seattle secondary, obviously, led by Tyreek Woolen. But these are 2 talented wide receivers, and then pretty much starts each and every week. DK Metcalf is start, coming off a monster game at the Patriots. And this offense, they're definitely opening things up with new offensive coordinator and new coaching staff all around in the first 2 weeks. So Metcalf coming off a big game last week. Jackson Smith-Njigba, a monster ball game last week, getting 16 targets in that one. He's a start, because this Miami secondary I don't think is all that great. And in the first couple weeks, we've seen teams go up and down the field on them. Tyler Lockett, tough to trust weekly. And this week he's a sit, because I think Jackson Smith-Njigba, as the weeks go on, we're going to see more great performances from him, where Tyler Lockett will be phased out a little bit. Panthers at the Vegas Raiders. Andy Dalton, the quarterback for this Panther team now. And he can't be any worse than Bryce Young. We know Dalton's a gunslinger. He takes those deep chances and he gets that football down the field. But I have to see what this Panther team looks like before I could recommend starting in any of their receivers. So Deontay Johnson, a sit. He's done nothing the first 2 weeks. Xavier Legette, he hasn't done much really. Goose egg in last week's game. And Adam Thielen, the aging veteran, even though I think he could be decent with Andy Dalton at the quarterback position. But this week, even in a decent matchup with the Raiders, they're all sits. Now for the Raiders, Devontae Adams, you draft him 2nd, 3rd round latest. He's a start each and every week. Last week, a monster game at the Ravens. 9 catches, 110 yards, found the end zone. He's locked in. Jacoby Myers, he hasn't done much. And it's tough to trust many guys on this offense besides Brock Bowers and Devontae Adams. So Jacoby Myers, even in a plus matchup, he's a sit. Baltimore Ravens at the Dallas Cowboys. Zay Flowers, the only wide receiver you would trust on this Baltimore Raven team. He's a start. He's getting a lot of targets. They use him in different formations. They use him as a gadget guy. And last week, the Cowboys couldn't stop anyone. And I think this week, Zay Flowers, he's good for a deep ball touchdown as well. Rashad Bateman, we know he's a speedy wide receiver. We know he was a high draft pick a few seasons ago, but no consistency it's been throughout Bateman's career. And even this week versus a bad secondary that we saw last week, he's a sit. CeeDee Lamb is start each and every week. Last week, 65-yard touchdown, and that was it pretty much for the Cowboys offense. And this week, tough matchup versus this Raven team, where we know Baltimore's 0-2 now, and this is a must-win ball game for them. But CeeDee Lamb's going to get his numbers. He's going to put up his points. He's matchup-proof. He was a top 2-3 pick for a reason. Brandon Cooks, inconsistent wide receiver. His best years are behind him. After coming off a nice week 1, week 2 non-existent, he's a sit. Jalen Tolbert last week, a good ball game, a lot of garbage time. He's not really a fantasy option, so he's a sit for me. But I think Tolbert, as the year goes on, could emerge. But right now, I can't say he's an option. San Francisco 49ers at the Los Angeles. Samuel, he's going to miss time. And what else is new with Deebo Samuel? There's always an injury that pops up. He's a great talent. He's a great athlete. Great ball player, but once again, he's going to be out to Brandon Ayuk. He's going to be the number 1 wide receiver. And now with McCaffrey and Deebo Samuel out, Brandon Ayuk, he got paid the big bucks in the offseason, and now it's time for Brandon Ayuk to step up and make plays. So this week he's a start. Him and George Kittle should be peppered with targets. And Jawan Jennings, he's a sit for me, but I wouldn't be surprised if Jawan Jennings could go out there and have some impact. We saw in week 1 he had double-digit fantasy points in PPR leagues. And then last week it was just a weird ball game where no one really did much besides George Kittle and Jordan Mason for this 49er team. But Jawan Jennings is definitely someone to keep an eye on and off the waiver wire. It's sit for me, but definitely an option. And now to the Rams with Cooper Kupp and obviously Puka Nacua, who was out since week 1. He's dealing with DeMarcus Robinson, Tyler Johnson, and Tutu Atwell, Jordan Whittington as his wide receiver. So DeMarcus Robinson, he's a journeyman. He's going to be the number 1, I believe. And then Tyler Johnson, we've seen he's had chances with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but he really hasn't done much throughout his NFL career. So Tyler Johnson's a sit for me as well. Tutu Atwell, more of a deep ball threat, and a guy is a 3rd, 4th wide receiver in the slot. And Jordan Whittington, though, he's the wide receiver I believe could break out and be an option for this Los Angeles Ram team and possibly fantasy owners. Whittington could play the X and Y position at the wide receiver position. He could run the routes. He's a big physical kid. Sean McVay talked highly of him in the preseason, a 5th-round pick, and he earned this spot and had a big preseason, but this week we got to see it out of him. He's a sit. Detroit Lions at the Arizona Cardinals. Amon-Ra St. Brown, he did nothing in week 1, week 2. He went out there and had a monster game. I know he was banged up a little bit, but they said it was cramps and he just contusion. So St. Brown looks like he should be good in this one. And now the Lions 1-1. They got to go in there into Arizona, and I think this could be a potential shootout. So St. Brown, he's locked in as a start each and every week. Jameson Williams, he's getting to that start option now each and every week. A deep ball threat for this Lion team. In the first 2 weeks of the season, he's definitely been skyrocketing up the ranking board and making big plays. So once again, he's a start for me. Marvin Harrison, week 1, a lot of people panicked. Only 1 catch, 4 yards, and then in the first 7 minutes of week 2's ball game versus the Los Angeles Rams, he found the end zone twice and went over 100 yards. So Marvin Harrison, he's number 1 wide receiver. He could run all the routes. He could get behind any secondary. And I think after 1 bad week, he got it out of the system, and him and Murray got on the same page. And also they made it a known thing that we're going to get him the football early and often. And he went off with a big game, so he's a start each and every week. Michael Wilson, Greg Dortch, inconsistent in this offense. They're the 4th or 5th options anyway behind Kyler Murray running the football, Connor, Marvin Harrison, Trey McBride. So those players, they're going to be inconsistent each week, and they're both sits. Kansas City Chiefs at the Atlanta Falcons, Sunday Night Football. Rashee Rice, he's a start each and every week. Pretty much the only consistent player in this offense so far now, with Isaiah Pacheco out 6 to 8 weeks. Rashee Rice could run all the routes. He could make the plays in the middle of the field. And if there wasn't a suspension possibly coming into the year, where obviously there isn't now, he would have been a 3rd or 4th rounder, I believe, in fantasy drafts. Xavier Worthy, I'm going to give a sit. Week 1 was a little fluky. 2 touchdowns Xavier Worthy had on 3 touches in that ball game. And then last week he was non-existent, is the speedster in that victory versus Cincinnati Bengals. So this week I know indoor ball game, fast track, but Xavier Worthy, I have to see more out of him to be an option each and every week. Drake London, a start for me. I know he's gotten off to a slow start. In week 1 was Drake London. He's a solid wide receiver. And the thing is, Kirk Cousins isn't 100%, where most of his snaps have come out of the shotgun or the pistol, where that Achilles still isn't healed all the way. But Drake London, we know, is a playmaker. Kirk Cousins, as the weeks go on, I believe is going to get his legs under him. And if he don't, Michael Penix will come in, and I think Drake London will be fine. And this week in a matchup where they know they got to throw the football and put points on the board, I think London gets peppered with targets. Darnell Mooney, Ray McLeod. You have to see a lot out of those guys to have confidence to put them in your starting lineup. So they're easy sits this week. The first of 2 Monday night games, Jacksonville Jaguars at the Buffalo Bills. Brian Thomas Jr., he's been solid so far early in his NFL career. Last week, though, only 2 catches, 92 yards, which is big yards per catch, obviously. You got to see more consistency and more catches out of him, but I think he's a decent flex option in a ball game where Jacksonville knows they got to put points on the board versus Buffalo Bill team. So Brian Thomas is a flex I like. Christian Kirk, I said coming into the year, he's not going to be in there a lot, with Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas most likely going to lead the wide receivers in snaps. And so far, the first 2 weeks, Christian Kirk, he's only had 5 fantasy points in PPR league, so you can't trust Christian Kirk. I know he's a talented receiver. I know him and Trevor Lawrence have a good rapport, but he's a sit. And Gabe Davis, week 1, had a decent ball game, and week 2, he didn't do much. And Gabe Davis, he's just an inconsistent wide receiver throughout his career. I know it's a homecoming, and he wants to get back at his former team, but he's a sit. Khalil Shakir, the only wide receiver I could trust on this Bill team. He's a flex option, good PPR guy for the most part, and the number one option in this offense. Curtis Samuel hasn't done anything the first 2 weeks, and Keon Coleman, week 1 looked decent, but last week had a goose egg, and he pretty much wasn't targeted, so I can't trust the rookie yet. He's a sit. In the final game of the doubleheader Monday night, Washington Commanders at the Cincinnati Bengals. Terry McLaurin is a sit for me. He hasn't done much in the first couple weeks, and pretty much this offense is built around Jaden Daniels running the football a lot, running the football between the tackles with Brian Robinson, and dump offs to Austin Eckler, and hitting the tight ends and Zach Ertz and Ben Sinnott. That's pretty much this whole offense for the most part for this Washington Commander team. And this week they're versing a pretty good secondary of the Cincinnati Bengals. So McLaurin, I don't think he does much. And if he does, that's good to see him break out. But like I said, what we've seen from him the first couple weeks, he's a sit. Luke McCaffrey hasn't done much. I thought he would come into the year, have some impact. He could later on in the season, but he's a sit. And Noah Brown, he had a decent performance in week 2, but he's not going to be a starting option. He's a sit. Jamar Chase, a start for me. He was a buy low candidate as well for me this week. Jamar Chase, we know he's a great wide receiver, and it only takes him 1 or 2 ball games to go out there, get back on track, and put up numbers. So if a guy's dangling Chase in your league, I would go out there and try to make a move. He's a start, and I think him and Burrow in this one versus a weak secondary, you have a big game. And T. Higgins, if he returns in this one, I have to see him being healthy and see T. Higgins going out there making plays, because between last season and the first 2 weeks of this year, he's been pretty much non-existent and not doing much. Is Higgins. And Andre Isaac last week went out there, 2 touchdowns, 7 yards on 2 catches. That was a little fluky. Yeah, he was a goal line guy for the Cincinnati Bengal team, but we have to see more production, more targets, and more snap share for him to be an option. So that's wide receiver start sit every matchup, week 3 of the fantasy football season.